I'm John Gormley. Premier Brad Wall joining us on the phone from Halifax, where he has just broken away from the Premier's conference and the announcement of a further push on the health care budget question. Premier Brad Wall and Premier Giz of PEI being tasked with this. Premier, thanks for joining us for this couple of minutes.
Thanks, John.
Tell me about the health care announcement you've just made. Do you have a definitive report out at this point?
We do. A report's been released with real specific recommendations back to all the premiers. 6 months ago, the premiers asked Robert Giz and I to chair a working group of the health ministers of Canada, working with the doctors and the nurses of the country, the CMA and the CNA, to come up with a number of recommendations around clinical practice guidelines, and all that it would include our recommendations on the best standards of care, the best practices for certain kinds of care. More on that in a moment. Secondly, that we would look at different team models from across the country, where we're allowing healthcare professionals really to practice to their full scope, nurse practitioners, paramedics, nurses, doctors, with the aim of providing better care and, frankly, emergency services that are open and more available to Canadians. And the third one was health and human resources. 76% of our budget in Saskatchewan is human resources in terms of the healthcare budget. So we need to do more by way of cooperating with other provinces when we're talking about collective bargaining agreements and negotiating. It's a huge part of it, and also with the plan for the future in terms of training. So here's an example. On the clinical practice guidelines, diabetes is obviously devastating and a very prevalent chronic disease in the country, and it is in Saskatchewan. Well, there's a clinical practice guideline out there where the evidence shows they can reduce, through proper foot care, for those who have foot ulcers, they can reduce the number of amputations by 80%. In our case, that would mean 94 fewer amputations last year. Think of what that would mean to the patient. It also reduces the hospital stays from foot ulcers by 30%. There are 453 of those in the province. So again, better care, first and foremost. We'd say between $4 and $7 million, which we can invest in home care or use in other areas of health care. And that's by just adopting what Robert and what our group is recommending to the premiers in terms of care for diabetes and specifically foot ulcers. That's the kind of work we're doing, and it might seem like common sense, and it is probably, and probably people will say we should have been doing this before, and they're right as well, but we're getting it done now, and I think premiers welcome the report, and they've asked Premier Giz and I to continue for one more year.
Okay, so in that one more year, is it really the same kind of focus on efficiencies, or do you start to broaden into things like healthcare delivery, going beyond that?
Well, we're going to be pursuing generic drug bulk purchasing. We've said by next April we want to be able to start seeing the savings from identifying 3 to 5 generic drugs that we can buy. 64 generic drugs in Canada. Of the 64, there is a huge number where we are paying 90% more than the Americans pay, for example. So that's one piece of work going forward. Here's another one. The radiologists of our country recently came out and said 10 to 20% of the diagnostics that are done in the system, these are the radiologists who do the diagnostics that are saying this, are unnecessary. That goes to appropriateness of care. And so premiers have said, let's look at those things. Again, it's about better care, but it's also going to be about a sustainable system where we bend the cost curve because we all have to do that. And these two things are not mutually exclusive, John. We can find innovation that does improve care and actually does it more effectively and at a lesser cost, frankly, than is done currently.
Premier Brad Wall with us. Okay, the other story that has really been eclipsing a lot of your agenda, a lot of the participation by the premiers, is this 5-point plan laid out by BC. 4 of the points we get. If there's going to be a pipeline go across, they want state-of-the-art, risk tolerance, cleanup, these sorts of things. Then the 5th point, they want a fair share of the revenues and the royalties. I mean, when did holding your neighbor for ransom and shaking down your neighbor become part of Canadian federalism, according to Christy Clark?
Well, John, you can see why the people of British Columbia or the people of any province, when faced with the prospect of a pipeline like this, would say we want to mitigate environmental risks, and we'd like to see there be an economic benefit to this. Our point has been all along, to the extent we've been asked about the issue, is if that's the case, it should come from the companies. Obviously, it should come from the pipeline company and then maybe the oil companies on the other end who are now accessing a higher oil price, the Brent price, potentially, versus the lower West Texas. That's certainly possible in all of this. So That would be our point. We also understand the first four, but we've said publicly we support Alberta with respect to the last one. The people in British Columbia, the premier said, well, this wouldn't apply to anything else other than bitumen. Well, 20% of the world's uranium at any given time can be mined and produced in Saskatchewan. It has to get out of Saskatchewan. Some of it, maybe a small amount west of us. Is there going to be a demand for royalties down the road from us? That's the precedent we're worried about. Or even potash, which they would say, well, that's not environmentally hazardous. Well, but this is the precedent business, John, as you know, politics, and that's our concern. Finally, one other point. The backgrounders in the BC report intimate that we're also in the production of oil sands, and we're currently exploiting the asset. And while there's that potential, we're nowhere close to it. So I worry about some of the facts that have gone into the analysis here. And obviously on the fifth point, we don't agree.
Okay, on that fifth point, though, Christy Clark, the premier, doesn't appear to be backing down. So what is the message that sends to particularly the other Western premiers?
Well, it's a concern, and there's going to be an energy strategy discussion here, and I'm not sure how that's all going to go. But the pipeline itself, the report that BC pointed to, will have a benefit for Saskatchewan as well. They say $4 billion. It might actually be more if it assists with pipeline capacity for our province, or if it kind of frees up that additional price for the overall system. It's pretty unclear now, but we have energy and resources officials in our province looking at it. They actually don't agree with the number that BC's used. Another problem with the analysis, they think it might be even a little bit bigger. So, the world today, especially the fast-growing economies of the world, want energy security and food security. And I like Canada's chances in that world. We have a real Canadian advantage as well as a Saskatchewan advantage in that world. But we got to be able to get our products to those markets. That's the bottom line. We are not blessed with ports in the province. There's no prospect of a port. Other jurisdictions have benefited from having those ports economically in the past. We need that to continue to work for the country. And then there's the Constitution. There's Section 121 that speaks to the importance of national commerce. I'm not even sure if some of this that's being proposed, including the withholding of power, which has been to the pipeline, is constitutional.
Mr. Premier, good having you by. The conference wraps tomorrow in the afternoon, and that's the focus on energy at that point?
We're going to be working on the economy later this day and through to tomorrow. So there's various issues. Immigration, we have concerns around there. We'd like to see the cap removed for Saskatchewan. Energy is going to be a part of that. Infrastructure, there's a number of economic issues moving forward. Travel safe. We'll see you soon. Thanks, John. Take care. Premier Brad Wall in Halifax at the what is called the Conference of the Federation. And that's really a fancy name, as the Premier in the past has said, sort of a Star Wars, Star Trek-y name for the Premier's Conference. Moments ago, Robert Giz, the Premier of PEI, and Premier Wall issued that health care position paper, among other things dealing with some clinical practice guidelines they want to see streamlined across the country. And the Premier's agreeing that they want one more year of work by the Wall and Giz side to see what can be done in health care.